There is a phrase that gets said at every funeral, every hospital bed, every moment when someone's life is falling apart. You've heard it. You've probably said it. God won't give you more than you can handle. It sounds right. It feels comforting. And millions of Christians hold on to it like a lifeline in their worst seasons. There's only one problem. It's not in the Bible. Not in the way people mean it. Not even close. And here's what's more unsettling. The actual teaching of Scripture on this subject is almost the exact opposite. Because when you read the Bible carefully, when you look at the lives of Moses, Paul, Elijah, Job, and Jesus himself, a different pattern emerges. A pattern that is harder to hear and far more honest. God does give people more than they can handle. He does it deliberately. He does it repeatedly. And he does it to the people he trusts the most. The question is not whether this is happening to you. The question is why. And the answer changes everything. Let's start at the source. Because the phrase, God won't give you more than you can handle, is almost always traced back to one verse. 1 Corinthians 10:13. Here's what it actually says. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. Read it again. Carefully this time. Paul is writing about temptation, the pull toward sin. He is promising that no temptation to do wrong will ever be so overwhelming that you have no choice but to give in because God always provides a way of escape. That is a real promise. And it's a powerful one. But it says nothing about the weight of life's burdens. Nothing about grief, nothing about illness, nothing about loss. Nothing about the seasons when everything falls apart at once and you feel like you cannot take one more day. Paul is not saying, your circumstances will never exceed your capacity. He is saying, sin will never be your only option. Those are two completely different statements. And here's how we know Paul wasn't making the first promise, because he made the opposite statement himself in the very next letter. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. Paul is writing to the same church just months later about what he had just experienced in Asia. He doesn't soften it. He doesn't frame it in triumphant language. He writes with a rawness that is almost uncomfortable to read. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. Utterly burdened beyond our strength, despaired of life itself. Sentence of death. This is the man who wrote, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This is the man who sang hymns in prison at midnight. This is the Apostle Paul, and he is describing a season where the weight was so far beyond what he could carry that he expected to die from it. If God doesn't give us more than we can handle, Paul's experience should not have been possible. But Paul doesn't stop there. He gives us the reason for it, and this is the pivot point of everything. He writes, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. That was to make us rely not on ourselves. The weight that broke Paul was not a malfunction. It was not God abandoning him. It was not evidence that something had gone wrong. It was the entire point. Once you see this principle in Paul, you cannot stop seeing it everywhere in Scripture, because it is everywhere. Let me walk you through the pattern. Moses. There is a moment in the book of Numbers, Numbers 11, that almost nobody preaches on, because it is uncomfortable. And it doesn't fit the version of Moses we prefer to remember. Israel has been complaining again. About the food, they are in the wilderness, surviving on manna that God sends every morning, and they are weeping at the doors of their tents, wishing they were back in Egypt, back in slavery. Because at least in slavery there were cucumbers. Moses hears it, all of it, every family, wailing, and something in him breaks. He turns to God and says, Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me now." Moses asked God to kill him, not in a moment of spiritual weakness, not in a crisis of faith. Moses was one of the most intimate with God of any person in human history. He spoke with God face to face, the way a man speaks with his friend, and the weight of his calling drove him to the point of asking God to end his life. That is more than he could handle, by his own testimony. And God's response was not to rebuke him for lack of faith. God's response was to appoint 70 elders to share the burden, to come alongside Moses and carry what he could not carry alone. The answer to too much was not, "You're wrong, you can handle it." The answer was community. Shared weight, help, Elia. We already know this story from the last video, but let's go deeper into it. 1 Kings 18. Elijah calls down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel. He defeats 450 prophets of Baal in the most dramatic single event of his entire ministry. The fire falls. The people fall on their faces. The false prophets are destroyed. It is a complete, total, public victory. Then Jezebel sends a message. "I will kill you by tomorrow." And Elijah, the man who just stood alone against 450 prophets and one, runs. He runs into the wilderness. He collapses under a tree, and he prays this: "It is enough. Take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Enough, I'm done. Let me die." The greatest victory of his ministry led directly to the greatest emotional collapse of his life. The weight, in the aftermath of the miracle, was more than he could carry. God did not rebuke him. God sent an angel, twice, with food and water, because Elijah's body and soul were depleted beyond what he could replenish on his own. The angel's words are almost tender. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." Too great for you. God said it himself. This is too much for you to carry alone. Job. The book of Job opens with God himself vouching for Job's character. Blameless, upright, a man who fears God and turns away from evil, not a compromised believer, not someone with hidden sin. God says Job is the best example of a faithful human being on the face of the earth. And then Job loses everything: his children, his wealth, his health, in rapid succession. And eventually his friends come, the ones who were supposed to comfort him, and spend the rest of the book telling him that his suffering must be his fault. Job maintains his innocence. He does not understand what is happening, and the weight becomes so heavy that in chapter 3 he curses the day he was born. He does not curse God, but he curses his own existence. He wishes he had never been. That is more than a man can handle. God never appears to Job to explain the backstory. He never tells Job about the conversation in heaven that started everything. He shows up in the whirlwind and asks Job where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid. And somehow that is enough. Not an explanation, not an apology, just the overwhelming presence of God himself. And Job is restored, but not before the weight nearly destroyed him. Paul again. Beyond the 2 Corinthians passage, Paul catalogues his experience in chapter 11 of the same letter. He lists what his calling actually cost him. 5 times I received 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits. I have labored and toiled, and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. That is not a list of trials that were perfectly calibrated to a person's capacity. That is a life that exceeded what any human being was designed to carry, repeatedly, without relief, for years. And Paul carried it, not because he was strong enough, because God was. So now we have to ask the real question: why does God allow this? not just as a theological exercise, but as a personal one. Because if this pattern is real, and if it applies to you right now, you need to understand what God is doing in it, because the why changes everything about how you respond. Paul gave us the answer in that 2 Corinthians passage. But let's unpack it fully. That was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Every word matters here, not on ourselves. The default setting of every human being, including the most spiritually mature ones, is self-reliance. We are wired to solve problems, to manage circumstances, to handle things. It is not a character flaw. It's how we were made. But it becomes a spiritual ceiling. Because a person who can handle everything on their own has no functional need for God. They might believe in God, they might thank God, but they don't need God. Not in the bone deep, this is my only option way. And God loves you too much to let you live at the ceiling, but on God. The move is not from self-reliance to helplessness. It's from self-reliance to God-reliance. Completely different outcomes. One is collapse. The other is strength, just not your own. Paul writes elsewhere, "When I am weak, then I am strong. Not when I am weak, I fall apart. When I am weak, because I have been brought to the end of what I can carry, then I am actually strong, because I am finally in the position where God's strength can work through me rather than around me." Who raises the dead? Paul doesn't say rely on God who helps you carry heavy things. He says who raises the dead. The most extreme power God has, the thing that is furthest beyond human capacity. Paul is saying, the God you are being forced to rely on is the same God who reverses death itself. Whatever has died in your life, whatever feels permanently gone, is within range of that power. The weight that brought you to your knees is also the thing that brought you to the only one who could actually do something about it. Here is the principle in its simplest form. God gives more than you can handle, so that you stop trying to handle it and start letting Him. Because there is a version of your life where you are strong enough, organized enough, capable enough to manage everything on your own, and that version is the most spiritually dangerous version of your life. Not because strength is wrong, but because self-sufficiency produces a specific kind of blindness, the blindness that comes from never needing to look up. The weight is the mercy. I know that is a hard sentence. I'm not saying it to be provocative. I'm saying it because it's what Paul learned from the inside, from the bone, from the season where he despaired of life itself. And what he learned changed the entire orientation of his ministry. He stopped writing about what he was capable of. He started writing about what God was capable of through him. So what does this mean for the season you are in right now? Let me give you 3 things that happen when God allows more than you can handle, things that cannot happen any other way. First, you discover what you were actually relying on. When life is manageable, it is very easy to believe you are trusting God when you are actually just trusting yourself. You feel close to God when things are going well. You pray, you read, you show up. But underneath, your security is your income, your health, your plan, your relationships, your ability to figure things out. You don't discover this until those things are threatened or removed. Then, suddenly, the thing you thought was your supplement, the routine spiritual practices layered on top of your life, becomes your only option. And that is when you find out whether your faith is real, or whether it was just the pleasant thing you did when you had enough margin to do pleasant things. The weight reveals what is actually holding you up, and sometimes what it reveals is that the thing holding you up was never God. Second, you develop a kind of compassion that cannot be manufactured. Moses could not have led 2 million broken, afraid, complaining people through a wilderness if he had not himself been broken by the weight of it. Elijah could not have ministered to the widow of Zarephath, who was preparing her last meal before she and her son died of starvation, if he had not himself been fed by ravens in a wilderness and understood what it was to have no visible source of provision. The weight produces something in you, a capacity for another person's suffering that simply does not exist in people who have not suffered. Paul writes in the same passage, the very verse before the one about being burdened beyond strength, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. The comfort flows through you, not from you, but only after it has first flowed into you, in the place where you had no other option but to receive it. Your suffering is not wasted, it is being redirected. Third, your faith becomes unshakable instead of theoretical. There is a kind of faith that has never been tested. It believes all the right things, it can quote the right verses, but it has never been in the place where the verse was the only thing it had to stand on. And then there is the faith of a person who went through the thing, who stood at the edge of what they could survive, and found that the ground held. Paul writes, we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. That chain, suffering to perseverance to character to hope, is irreversible. You cannot shortcut it. You cannot produce perseverance without something to persevere through. You cannot build character without a situation that requires it. You cannot arrive at hope that has been refined in the fire without first going into the fire. The weight that feels like it is breaking you may be the very thing that is making you the kind of person who cannot be broken. Let me ask you something direct. What are you carrying right now that is too heavy for you? Not the things you are managing fine, the things that, if you are honest with yourself, are beyond what you have the capacity to handle. The things you wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about. The situation that makes you feel like if it doesn't change soon, you're not sure what will happen. Here is what I want you to notice. Most people, when they hit that place, do one of three things. They push harder, work more hours, try more strategies, research more solutions, control more variables. They increase effort as a response to inadequacy. And there are seasons where that is appropriate. But if you have been pushing harder for a long time, and the weight keeps increasing, if your maximum effort is still not enough, pushing harder is not the answer. It is just a slower version of collapse. Or they numb it. Scroll more, drink more, stay busier. Anything to stop feeling the weight of it for a few hours. The weight doesn't go anywhere. It waits. Or, and this is the third option, the one nobody naturally gravitates toward, they stop. They admit they cannot carry it, and they put it down, not by walking away from it, but by handing it to someone whose hands are big enough to hold it. Peter wrote, cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Cast. Not release gently, not gradually transfer. Cast, the word used for throwing a net into water. With force, with intentionality, with the deliberate act of letting go of the weight and trusting that the one you throw it to can hold what you can't. What would it look like, today, to stop trying to carry what was never designed to be carried by you? There is something at the end of Paul's 2 Corinthians passage that I don't want you to miss. After he describes being burdened beyond his strength, after he explains that the purpose was to make him rely on God, he writes one more line. He will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will deliver us again. He delivered us. He will deliver us again. Past tense and future tense, both. Paul is not writing from the middle of the crisis. He is writing from the other side of it. And what he wants the Corinthians to know is not just that he suffered, but that he came out, that the God who allowed the weight also carried him through it. That utterly burdened beyond our strength did not end with death. It ended with deliverance. And with a faith that knew from the inside, from the lived experience of the weight, that deliverance was real. That is the testimony available to you on the other side of what you are in. Not a testimony about how strong you were, not a testimony about how you figured it out, how you held it together, how you managed it. A testimony about a God who raised the dead, who carried what you couldn't carry, who delivered you, and who will deliver you again. You were not built to carry this alone. you were never supposed to be. Stop trying to hold what only he can hold, and discover, maybe for the first time, what it actually feels like to let him.